Today is Wednesday, May 31st, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Today I'd like to talk about an important topic in parenting, and anyone with children should take this issue very seriously. If you have children, you're probably already disturbed about the issue that I'd like to talk about, and sometimes you may feel like you're going crazy because things just really seem so bizarre today. But there's no question that evil in this generation is growing. And in every generation, Christians have talked about when the world will end. Christians have talked about when the Antichrist will appear, whether or not we're going to experience those last days, and so on. Every generation has imagined that it might be the last generation. St. Paul spoke as if he expected the world to end at any minute. And all through history, we can find Christians who believe that they're living in the last days. And by last days, I mean here the very last days. And they're sort of looking out their window, reading the news, following current events, and asking, could this be the end? Are we living at the end of the world? Are we about to witness the unfolding of the final events of world history? Because sometimes it seems like things really can't get any worse than they are. And as soon as we say that, we realize that no, this is probably not the end time, because things can certainly get much, much worse. This is probably not the end. Now, if we do this, if we spend our time following the current events, reading the headlines, and even worse, listening to people trying to sell books and make money by stirring up fears that the end is near, there's always a group of men presenting themselves as God's prophets who've been sent to announce that the end is at hand. And they're always proven to be false, and then another group rises up in their place, and it just keeps going on and on, generation after generation. But if we go about it that way, if we go about by following the news headlines, trying to imagine what the significance is of different political events that are reported around the world, try to read into all different problems around us, disease outbreaks, weather emergencies, and so on, we'll always end up making the same mistakes, saying the same foolish things, and embarrassing ourselves and embarrassing the Christian faith, which is worst of all. So as we think about this, when we think about the obvious importance of discerning the times, and we know that trying to predict whether or not the end of the world is at hand is a a foolish errand, one that even Jesus told us not to attempt. When he was asked if the end is near, he said, "Only the Father knows this." In other words, it's none of our business. And that attempt to try to predict whether this is the end is contrary to Christ's will for us. That's not a right disposition. That's not what we should be thinking about. That's not what we should be asking, not what we should be studying, and so on. It's also a sign of a disordered will, because we shouldn't want the end to be near. Seeing how many unbelievers there are in the world, seeing how many people are lost in sin, the end of the world would mean their condemnation, and therefore no person who has a heart like God's would want the end to come anytime soon, because there's such great need for evangelization and conversion. It seems to be an increasing need for evangelization and conversion. God forbid that the end should come anytime soon. So if it's really impossible for us to try and forecast the end of the world, and if it's really not charitable for us to desire that the world should end quickly, what should we think about in terms of the end times? What should we be thinking about? What should we be concerned with in light of the teaching that does exist in the scriptures about the end times? And I think we have an answer to that question if we look at St. Paul's writings in 2 Timothy chapter 3. 2 Timothy chapter 3. Inspired by the Holy Spirit, writing to St. Timothy, St. Paul talks to Timothy, who was a bishop. So let's keep all of this in context. Timothy is not some gardener out in the backyard that St. Paul's writing to or talking to. St. Timothy is a bishop in the church, one who was appointed by St. Paul himself. St. Paul writes to Timothy and tells him, or describes for him, what the end times or the last days will be like. What will be the characteristics that mark the last days. And he doesn't start talking about wars. He doesn't start talking about different leaders that will rise up. He doesn't talk about political events or economic philosophies. He doesn't warn about communism or capitalism. He doesn't warn about Chinese dictators or Russian nuclear missiles. He doesn't talk about any of these political issues, any of these historical developments. He talks about moral problems. He talks about moral issues that will increase and mark the last days. And so I think the best way for us to have some profitable meditation on the last days is to consider the moral qualities of the last days. And as I said before, it's common for Christians to imagine that they're living in the worst of times, in what must be the last days. But as long as we can imagine things getting much worse, we don't have reason to think that this is the end. Because it's going to get worse and worse. And let's be realistic. In America, we live in a country where the Catholic Church is exempt from taxes. That's not exactly a condition of persecution. We live in a country where Christian schools can operate as non-profit organizations and not only be exempt from taxation on their revenue, but also have donations given to them by their supporters be exempt from income taxes. So it's obvious that the condition of the church today, the condition in which Christians live, at least in America, is certainly not to be considered a state of persecution. Far from it. Our churches are on Main Street. Our meetings are public and open. Many of the politicians in our country, many of the legislators, the Supreme Court justices, judges all through the judicial system are Christian people. And so it's clear that we are not living in a time of persecution. Things can get much, much worse. Parents are allowed to homeschool their children. I'm allowed to keep my children home from the public school and provide my children with a Christian education that I desire them to receive. This is clearly not a state of persecution. And yet at the same time, we can see that there are people around us who wish it were otherwise. It's very clear that there are people living around us who wish that the state would persecute the Christians, would lock up the Christians, would shut down the churches, would make homeschooling illegal, and so on. There are certainly people who are upset at the freedoms that Christians have at present, and they would do everything in their power to bring them to an end. And in the behavior of these people, we see the marks, the foreshadowings of the last days. And these different evils certainly exist in degrees. And I think many of us can honestly, not with exaggeration, but honestly say that these things are worse today than they were 30 years ago. And what I'd like to do is take a look at what St. Paul wrote in 2 Timothy 3 to see what these characteristics are of the last days, and then consider whether these things are increasing around us in the present generation. And I'd like to take some time to focus on one of these, or maybe a couple of these in particular, which I think are most important for the kinds of people who would be listening to this talk. So let's take a look at 2 Timothy chapter 3. I encourage you to just pause the talk for a minute and grab a Bible so you can put a bookmark on the page where this passage is found, and spend some time reading it and rereading it and reflecting on it as you think about modern circumstances. 2 Timothy chapter 3. I'm reading here from the Dewey Reams Bible. St. Paul says to St. Timothy, know this, in the last days shall come dangerous times. In the last days shall come dangerous times. St. Paul is speaking in the future tense. So he doesn't necessarily believe that he's living in those last times, even though all of these qualities will be present in his own time, as his own martyrdom proves. But he speaks in the future tense of the last times, and the first quality he names is that they shall be dangerous times. And obviously, he means dangerous for Christians, dangerous for the church. Again, he's talking to a bishop. He's saying, in the last days, there shall be dangerous times. And Paul, remember, St. Paul is no coward. He's not the kind of person who gets nervous when he hears a bump in the night. St. Paul is a man who was willing to be beaten almost to death for the sake of the gospel and get back on his feet and walk right back into the city where he was beaten. St. Paul is not a man afraid of trouble, and he confesses that the last days shall be dangerous times. And as I said, if I think about the quality of our lives today, I really don't believe that we can say we live in dangerous times. I think we can say that things are getting more dangerous, and we can see how they can become more dangerous. But I don't think it's fair to say that we're living in dangerous times. I think that there would be some changes that would be signs that danger was coming. I think that the government would go after homeschooling, for example. I think the government would take away the church's tax exemption. So there are signs I think we can watch out for that would show us that things are getting more dangerous, that we're moving towards a time of persecution. But I think these benefits are signs that we're not there yet. We're not there yet. But as I said, there are people alive around us today who would take those benefits away tomorrow, if they could. And these things can change rapidly. Just think of the political change that happened between 2016 and 2023. Think how radically the political landscape has shifted as presidents have changed, and we've gone from left to right to left. It's very turbulent. And when we go through these election seasons, we really have no idea where we're going to end up. And this democratic society, which was supposed to eliminate a lot of the trouble and turbulence of monarchies and the different religious convictions and agendas of successors to thrones, it doesn't seem like democracy has eliminated that problem. We have no idea what things will be like in 2025 after the next elections. But the last days will be dangerous times. St. Paul goes on to say the following. He says, "Men shall be lovers of themselves." Men shall be lovers of themselves. And St. Thomas comments on this passage. I just looked over his commentary briefly because I wanted to do so before I talked about this passage. St. Thomas says that to be lovers of themselves means that men seek to indulge their desires for things, for possessions, for pleasures, and so on. Men are lovers of themselves. They cherish themselves and take care of themselves. Men are lovers of themselves. He then says that men are covetous. The second vice that marks the last days would be an increase in covetousness, which is the love of money. When we read the root of all evil is the love of money, that's covetousness. The desire for more and more and more. And as we think about these different sins, remember, they exist in different degrees. And we can ask, is this increasing in our generation? Is it staying the same, or is it decreasing? Maybe there will be a time of revival where we'll get to a point where things seem really bad, and then God will be gracious to us and bring about a revival of true religion, pour out His grace upon us and turn this clock back, as it were, and bring to us a time of refreshing. That could happen. That could happen. I could see that happening politically, for example. Just to share my own personal political views, I happen to like Ron DeSantis as a presidential candidate. I'm just beginning to learn about him, but as I look at the different presidential candidates, I see someone like Ron DeSantis, I listen to his speeches, and I could see someone like him leading something of a revival of Christian decency and morality and patriotism in America. I could see that happening in the next election cycle or two. But I have no idea, and I don't put much weight in politics anyway. But my point is simply, we don't know what could happen in any given election cycle, and God could grant us a time of revival, a time of grace. But we have to ask, are these sins which are spoken of as the sins of the last days, are they increasing in a way that might show us that we're getting closer, that things are getting worse? And I would argue that covetousness does seem to be increasing. Covetousness does seem to be increasing. And the reason why I say that is because technology and politics are collaborating to concentrate wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people. The use of technology to eliminate human jobs, to bring greater profits to smaller numbers of people, willfully using technology to gain a greater share of available resources or a greater share of the market, and to do so in a way that has no limit. There's no point at which someone will say, I think that's enough, let someone else have some. There seems to be no limit. I recently read about Saint Fiacre, who was a patron saint of gardening and farms. And he was a monk, and he asked, I think I have this story right, so bear with me. He asked if he could have some land to take care of, to garden and cultivate. And the tradition says that the bishop told him that he could have as much land as he could cultivate by hand in one day. And so we see that there's this natural limit to what one should possess based on what he can responsibly take care of. And even if we go back in history, and again, I live on a farm and study history for a living, so I've spent a lot of time studying the history and philosophy of agriculture. When we go back through history, we find that the measures of land were made based on how much time it took to plow the land. So the amount of land that could be plowed in a day was considered one unit of measure for land. And men got an idea of what the ideal amount of land was, which they could responsibly and profitably take care of. And to seek anything beyond that was just considered wasteful, something disordered. Just owning things for the sake of owning things, so just so that they could be yours and no one else could profit from them, even though you had no way to make profitable use of them. That's the idea of covetousness, just unlimited desire for possessions, when there are real natural limits to what may be desired. Our farm here is 13 acres, and it's far more than I could ever manage. And yet there are farmers who live around us who own thousands of acres of land. So much land that they really can't even make profitable use of it and rely on government subsidies to pay them to produce crops that aren't profitable on the land that's being used. That's a sign of covetousness. Meanwhile, there are people who don't have a square inch of land to take care of or work among those who would work the land. Not many would, which is another problem. So we see technology appears to be leading to an increase in covetousness, unlimited desire for wealth for wealth's sake. Elon Musk is worth $200 billion, and he's still trying to create new companies. He's still trying to control new markets. Jeff Bezos, similarly, already owns the biggest online store on the planet, and just continues to expand into other areas, other departments, just to control more and more for the sake of controlling it. And it appears that covetousness is increasing. St. Paul also says that men will be haughty, and proud. And St. Thomas explains that haughtiness is a species of pride. It's a kind of pride. Later he says puffed up down in verse 4. That's another kind of pride. But all of these are summed up in the word pride itself. In the last days, men will be proud. Well, weren't they proud in the first century? Yes, they were proud in the first century, but what St. Paul seems to suggest here is that human pride will increase and be greater in the last days. Men will be haughty. Men will be proud. Men will be lovers of themselves. Men will be covetous. And this will be true in a greater degree, in an increasing degree, as the last days approach. He then says, they will be blasphemers. Blasphemers. That is, they'll have no respect for religion, no respect for God or for divine things. He says that they will be disobedient to parents. Disobedient to parents. And this is the one quality that I'd like to come back to and talk about a little bit in light of current events. He says that in the last days, one of the moral signs of the last days will be an increase in disobedience to parents. He says that in the last days, men will be ungrateful. And again, of course, men were ungrateful in the first century when St. Paul lived, but he's saying the ungrateful spirits of men will be greater. So much greater will these sins be that these will be dangerous times. Men will be ungrateful. He says they'll be wicked. That is, they'll do cruel and terrible things. Men will be wicked. Men will be without affection. Without affection. Cold-hearted. Without peace. Miserable. Men will have no peace in the last days. They'll be unhappy. They'll be perturbed, vexed, unsettled, frustrated, and so on. Men will be slanderers. They'll speak evil of others. They'll have no respect for others, but will speak evil of them without thinking much of it. Men will be incontinent. They won't control themselves. They won't keep promises that they make. They won't keep resolutions that they make because they have no self-control. They're incontinent. Men will be unmerciful. Unmerciful. There will be no tenderness, no mercy. And if we think of the works of mercy that the church teaches us, things like feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, giving drink to the thirsty, and so on, teaching the ignorant, burying and praying for the dead. Think of the works of mercy. Those things will not be practiced in the last days. Are these things increasing in our time? Are they decreasing? Are they staying the same? I would argue that some seem to be increasing. Some seem to be increasing. Now, I don't know if this is true or if there are certain circumstances that simply cause them to appear to be true. For example, when I was a kid, I couldn't go on the computer and watch YouTube videos of school fights and police brutality incidents. I couldn't go online and look at pictures of all kinds of different crimes and evils being committed around the world. I couldn't see video of war, all kinds of gory footage of fights and killings and executions and so on. I didn't have access to any of that stuff. I couldn't go on the internet and look at pornography as kids can today. I didn't have access to these things. And so maybe it appears that things are much worse simply because I'm able to see things today that were hidden and were unable to be seen when I was a kid. That can certainly be true, and I think we have to be careful of not exaggerating the actual evil in our generation simply because we see more of it because of the internet and social media. If you look at statistics, you can go online and look up crime statistics and things like that. You'll actually find that in many different areas, crime is actually lower than it was, say, in the 1990s. Violent crimes are down today, if the statistics are true. So things may appear to be worse, but not actually be worse. And we've got to beware of that possible error in judgment. We've got to ask ourselves, are things actually worse, or am I just looking at and seeing more bad things than I did in the past? That could certainly be true. For example, when I go into town, and I live a relatively private life, when I go into town, I don't see much evil. I don't see much that I didn't see when I was a kid. I don't see much worse than I saw when I was a kid. I will admit one thing. It does seem to me that people have less money today in many places than they did when I was a kid. To go to the store and see how many people seem like they can barely dress themselves, like they barely have clothing. It does appear that financially things may be worse for most Americans than they were when I was younger, but I don't know if that's actually true. Men will be unmerciful, without kindness. Next, St. Paul says, men in the last days will be traitors. Traitors. This I can definitely say is worse than it was when I was a kid. Because when I was a kid growing up in America, there was a great deal of patriotism. I went to a public school where there was a big American flag waving on the front lawn of the school. Every classroom had an American flag, had patriotic images. We sang patriotic songs. We said the Pledge of Allegiance every day at the beginning of the school day. We went to parades on government holidays. I can definitely say that there was much more of a sense of patriotism when I was a kid. And I knew about things that happened before I was born, like Vietnam War protests and things like that. But there was very little of that in America when I was growing up. American sentiment was pretty strong. I felt like my generation was pretty patriotic. We had grandfathers who were World War and Korean War veterans. We had uncles and fathers who were Vietnam War veterans. Most of our generation were happy to be Americans and were proud of our country. And that's definitely changed today. I have nieces who go to public schools, and I know for certain that they don't pray or they don't say the Pledge of Allegiance. I know there's no patriotism in their education. They certainly don't have that spirit that was present in my generation. There aren't many towns anymore that have holiday parades that celebrate American life. I wish there were. Those parades were provide very happy memories for me. Like I said, I was very proud growing up to be an American, and I mean proud in the good sense. I was patriotic as a kid. I loved being an American. And it wasn't some sort of selfish, nationalistic patriotism where I hated other countries. I loved being American. It was positive. I loved America. I loved my country. I loved being an American. We just had a lot better culture, I think. For example, I played Little League Baseball, and at the beginning of the season, there would be big parades to mark the beginning of the baseball season, and all the families would be out for the parades. All the kids would be dressed in their uniforms. All the different veterans groups in the area would be in our parade. There'd be marching bands. We'd have the Star-Spangled Banner sung at the baseball fields. We'd have the American flag sewn as a patch on our sleeves of our uniforms. The same was true during football season. Sports were very American when I was a kid. It was a very different spirit than what we see today. And so when we think about this characteristic of the last days, that men will be traitors, it's not very hard to imagine that there would be people in America who would be willing to betray our government, who would be willing to betray people who don't vote the way they do, and bring our country, bring America into some kind of trouble by assisting other nations who present themselves as enemies. It's very easy to imagine that there would be millions and millions of Americans today who would be willing to do that. It seems like treachery is increasing at the present time. But again, that could be dependent on leadership. I grew up with Ronald Reagan as the President of the United States, who won the presidential election in a landslide, with all Americans voting for him to be the president. It was a very different political climate. He was a great leader. He was a great American. And we haven't had that. Some people think Donald Trump is that kind of a leader. I don't necessarily agree with that. But I certainly know that some of these democratic leaders we've had are about as far opposite as could be imagined with respect to Ronald Reagan. And like I said, I remember talking about Ronald Reagan in my 4th grade social studies class. I remember that like it was yesterday. So it could be a matter of leadership. This lack of patriotism could simply be owed to the fact that there hasn't been a leader who has brought the American people together and made us proud to be American. And I have no idea who such a leader might be, or if it's even possible anymore. But treachery definitely seems like a sin that's increasing in modern society. And I think that's true around the world. Next, St. Paul speaks about stubborn. People who are stubborn. And I assume there that would mean people who refuse to receive correction, who simply pursue their own will, regardless of counsel or authority or precedence of any kind, just persist with their own interests. And then he says, puffed up. Puffed up means pretenders, people who are arrogant and think that they're capable of things that they're not. St. Thomas says, those who are puffed up take upon themselves works that they're not able to perform and they always fail. I could imagine the sin of being puffed up, being found in places where men try to do more than they're capable of, because this relates to covetousness. I actually was listening to Steve Bannon criticizing Ron DeSantis's presidential campaign announcement because he went on live with Elon Musk on Twitter Spaces, and the Twitter Spaces were crashing, and the announcement was delayed and interrupted by all these technical troubles. And Steve Bannon was tearing into Elon Musk, saying, this is what Elon Musk does. He gets control of all these different aspects of our society, and he just causes trouble in them. And we can see how being puffed up, imagining that we can do things like Elon Musk talking about traveling and settling on Mars, is just about as puffed up as one can get. So we can see how being puffed up can relate to covetousness. That's another of these sins that St. Paul talks about, being puffed up. Next he says, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. I don't think we need to discuss that one very much. Lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. So when Jesus says to us, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and we find that people aren't willing to do that because they would rather seek pleasures of this life, or when we see the church praying for religious vocations and we find Christian people have no interest in religious vocations because they would rather have the pleasures of married life, and they're talking about what's for dinner, they're talking about sexual pleasures or just creature comforts and vacations and things like that. And we see Christian people pursuing those kinds of things rather than religious disciplines for God's sake. We can clearly see in a time where there are almost no vocations that there appears to be an increase in men who are lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. We can see the disposition in the minds of the saints and the way they thought about these things with the way that modern Christians think about these things. For example, Teresa of Avila, as great a saint as she is, a doctor of the church even, as great as she is, and she's one of my favorite saints, she was the kind of person that could easily have settled for married life. She was romantic. She loved romantic stories. In her biography, she talks about how her mother used to let her read all sorts of romantic stories to keep her out of trouble. She was very romantic. She could have easily settled into married life, but what was unique about Teresa of Avila was that she knew, intellectually, she knew that religious life was better than married life, and she chose religious life not because she desired it, not because she longed for it, but simply because she knew that it was a superior state of life. She chose it with an intellectual choice, what Aristotle would call a deliberate choice, not based on any feeling, not based on her desire necessarily, not based on inclinations in her, but she chose religious life simply because she knew that it was a more excellent state of life, and she trusted that God would give her the grace to come to love it. after she chose it. And we see how different that is from modern talk about vocational discernment. Because the truth is the same today. Religious vocations remain the more excellent state of life. That can never change. And so when we hear young people talking about discerning vocations, we don't hear them asking, like St. Teresa did, which is the more excellent state of life. We see them talking about what they desire, what they feel, what they want, and so on. I've talked to students about vocations, and they'll be 15 years old and they'll just say, I want to get married. I want to get married. And discernment means seeing if I want to be a priest or a monk, and they say, nah, I don't want to be a priest or a monk. That's not how Teresa of Avila discerned her vocation. And so we can see among Christian people, there's an increase in the love of pleasure rather than the love of God. And if that's true among Christian people, how much more is it obviously true among unbelievers? So I would argue that that is definitely something that is true. If we look back in history to see how hard Christians were willing to work to study, how much they were willing to sacrifice for the sake of evangelization and missionary work. Think about the great explorers of the 15th and 16th centuries. Think about the troubles that they took upon themselves. And like the Jesuits who lived for the greater glory of God. Think about that disposition and ask, is that disposition increasing today or decreasing? It's clearly decreasing. We can rarely find Christians who are willing to do anything unless they're provided with a salary and health insurance and they've got enough money to live comfortably, on and on and on. There's almost no way to get Christian works started today unless huge mortgages are taken out, and there's all kinds of debt and loans and fundraisers and pledges and all of this stuff just to get some Christians to do something. We almost have to guarantee that there will be no interruption in their pleasures. And if we can guarantee that, then they might be willing to do some work for God. We look back to the works that were done in past generations, founding schools, academic work and studies. We can clearly see that men were lovers of God rather than lovers of pleasure, much more than today. Next we read, having an appearance of godliness. Having an appearance of godliness, but denying the power thereof. Having an appearance of godliness, but denying the power thereof. St. Thomas says that this refers to the grace of charity. Having an appearance of godliness. After all, God is love. Having an appearance of God-likeness. Having an appearance of being charitable, but denying the power thereof. A good example of this, I would say, is found among religions like the Buddhists, who appear to have a form of godliness. They appear to be these peaceful, gentle people, but they simply seek to avoid evil. They don't positively seek to do good. They fall short of the Christian mission. The Christian mission is a supernatural mission. It's powered by the Holy Spirit. It's impossible. For men, it's foolishness for men thinking in their own natural condition. It's only by the power of the Holy Spirit that we can desire to do God's will and actually do it. We understand as Christians that there is a power of godliness. There's a power to overcome obstacles. Jesus says, you will say to this mountain, be removed and cast into the sea, and it will obey you. And we see this image of power in the Christian church. And we know that this power exists because God is with us. Not that it's our power, but that God is in fact truly with us. Not with us just as an idea or as a belief, but literally with us. And we see this in the sacrament of the Eucharist. God literally with us to help us do this work. We think of the stories in the Gospels like the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus looks at Andrew and says, we need to feed these people. And Andrew's like, there's no way we can feed these people. There's like 5,000 people here. We barely have anything for us to eat. There's no way we could feed these people. And the scripture says Jesus said this to test him because he already knew what he was going to do. And what ended up happening? They found a boy who certainly has no more power than Andrew. And this boy just had a few pieces of bread and some fish. And the great work, the great supernatural work of feeding 5,000 people was accomplished. Though the human contribution was normal. The power of God's working in and through us brought about this great miraculous feeding. And this is what we believe to be true of the Christian faith, of the Christian church. We believe that there's power to overcome all things. And this power allows us to lay down our lives. It allows us to be obedient when it looks like obedience is unpopular or a bad idea. It allows us to trust in God's providence and actually walk in God's commandments because we know that all things will work for the good of those who love God. We have as the symbol of our religion our Lord upon the cross. We look upon the crucifix and we see that human suffering, charity, we see that as a sign of power. And it reminds us of the voluntary suffering of our Lord, which was of course followed by his glorification. And yet in the world there is an appearance of godliness, but one that denies the power thereof. There's talk about religion, there's talk about Christianity, there's talk about God, there's talk about doing good and so on. But there's no sincere devotion to godliness because there's no sincere belief in the power of godliness. It's what John Henry Newman talked about when he criticized the sentimental religion that was present in the Church of England. He said it was a religion of sentiments and not really a living, active faith. A religion of assent where we nod to certain statements. We give something of a verbal assent, but it doesn't affect our hands or our feet or the works that we do in our lives. It's an appearance of godliness, but one that lacks and denies the power thereof. It's fake religion. It's an empty, shallow form of true religion, and I would argue that this is true of all Protestantism. All Protestantism is an appearance of godliness, but a denial of the power thereof. And if we think about what it is that Protestants deny of Catholic teaching, they deny those things that are most powerful, most glorious. They deny the Immaculate Conception, which is a teaching that relates to God's power and glory. They, in modern circles, may deny creation. They may turn to a theory of evolution invented by unbelievers because they just can't imagine that God could create the world out of nothing in a moment. They deny the power of true religion. We look at Protestants denying the real presence in the Eucharist. They deny that Christ would be willing to actually come and dwell among us in the flesh. They deny that and settle instead for sacraments that are mere symbols without any power, an appearance of godliness, but a denial of the power thereof. Is baptism necessary for salvation? Well, it's a sign. It's a sign. You don't if you have faith, you don't need baptism. It's a symbol. We'll keep it around just for the sake of appearances, but you don't have to be. It's not like it does anything. There's no power in baptism. It's just a symbol. That's not what true religion teaches. The sacrament of matrimony. It's not just an interesting relationship that Christians like. Not something that Christians invented. It's a relationship which is invested with divine power. It's a sacrament. It's permanent. It's capable, with the help of God's grace, of overcoming all distractions and obstacles in the world. They retain the appearance, but they deny the power thereof. Is that not an example of this sin increasing in the last days? I think it certainly is, and I think it will continue to do so. If you think about what Pope Pius X warned about with respect to modernism, is it not just this? Is it not this appearance of godliness that denies the power thereof? It certainly is. Maintaining appearances while denying the power thereof. Again, it's being in the Catholic Church, having an appearance of being a Catholic, but denying the infallibility of the papacy. Is that not an example of maintaining an appearance of godliness but denying the power thereof? It certainly is. Think of the sacrament of holy orders. Protestants starting their own churches, ordaining each other, appointing themselves as pastors of churches without even being ordained by anyone, but yet nevertheless referring to themselves with titles like pastor and reverend, talking about themselves in light of New Testament terms, having the appearance of apostles, but lacking all the power thereof. If there's one truth, one reality that damns Protestantism, it's the fact that there's There's no miracles that ever confirm the teaching or works of any Protestant reformers. Some will say, well, the Jansenists supposedly had miracles, but if you look into it, you find that they were just acting wacky like modern Pentecostals. Have you ever seen Pentecostals? Take a few minutes and take a ride through YouTube world, just Googling Pentecostalism, and look at that wackiness. That's what Jansenism looked like. Those are not miracles. The apostles performed miraculous works that were seen by all men, that led thousands and thousands of men to conversion. Miracles were performed by saints all through history, confirmed miracles, miracles that were confirmed even by non-Catholics. These things are Catholic, where not just an appearance but the power of godliness is present. This most certainly, I think, is increasing in modern times. So I'm going to stop there with that passage from 2 Timothy 3, verses 1 through 5. And as I mentioned earlier, there is one of these characteristics that I want to focus on. It's disobedience to parents, because this is something that today is becoming very clear. Disobedience to parents. This is really shocking in the present generation. I had a discussion with a woman today who claimed to be a Christian. I believe that she goes to a Catholic church somewhere. I had written and stated that I believe it's unwise to say in modern society that girls can go out into the world on their own, dressed immodestly, drinking, partying, going out to bars and clubs, and all these different modern activities and places where they're surrounded by unbelievers who are also drinking, if not doing drugs as well, and get themselves into trouble, and then say that these girls are in no way to blame for these situations. I said, I don't agree with that. I think it's a very foolish message to be given to young ladies. I don't think girls should be taught that. I don't think girls should be taught that they have the right and freedom to put on the slinkiest, sexiest outfit that they can find, go out with their friends or even alone, start drinking alcohol in public, again, if not going further, even into drugs like smoking marijuana, taking ecstasy and other recreational drugs. And then when bad things come of those nights out, throw the victim card on the table and say, I'm innocent, and this guy who thought that I was interested in the things that he was interested in is guilty. I said, we need to stop teaching this to our daughters, to girls. And not just our daughters, we need to stop teaching this in general, because other people's daughters read and hear these things and begin to think that these things are okay, especially when they hear them from Christian women or from Christian priests. They hear this talk about how a girl who is raped can never be considered culpable in her situation. It doesn't matter how she dresses. It doesn't matter where she goes or what she's doing. She has a right to do what she wants, and no one has a right to do anything harmful to her. That sounds, you see, that sounds like a responsible moral teaching. But when you start to dig into it, it's so irresponsible, so foolish to say these kinds of things and give girls these ideas. And this woman accused me of not being, quote unquote, Christian, in my opinion, because she was offended that I would suggest that a girl could be partly to blame for a terrible situation, like being raped, for example. And of course, she starts to twist my words and suggest things that I would never say in 1,000 years. Obviously, if a man, let me just back up and say, if people are having sex outside of marriage, they're already committing crimes against God. It doesn't matter whether it's so-called consensual or whether it's violent. And without, it doesn't matter. There's only one context in which there's any moral sexual activity, and it's within marriage between a husband and a wife. So how do we even get into these discussions in the first place? The discussions don't even make any sense. The whole entire situation is sin. The whole situation is sin. How do we start splitting hairs? The whole situation is sin. And like I said before, a prudent person sees evil coming and hides himself. Now, if we lived in the Garden of Eden, if we lived in paradise, maybe the girls could get dressed up and go out for the night and be surrounded by angels or innocent men. But none of us think that that's what's waiting at the bar or at the party. This woman who I was talking with, this is how crazy this rhetoric gets. She said, if there was a girl or a young lady, if there was a girl lying naked on the road, no man would have a right to touch her. And you just have to think of these arguments. You're literally saying, you're literally suggesting that a girl should think that she has the right to walk through town naked and say to herself, I can do this if I want to. No one has a right to touch me. And they present this as if this is some kind of reasonable deliberation. Do you think that a man has a right to touch a girl, even if she were to walk through the street? What are we even talking about in these discussions? What are we even talking about? We live in a fallen world. Christianity teaches that. Christianity teaches us that men, human beings, are evil. We're taught that human beings are evil. You're warned that I am evil. I'm warned that you are evil. Jesus said to the rich young man, only God is good. We're always to be on guard when we're among men. We're always to walk circumspectly. We're always to be careful. We're always to assume that men in their natural behavior will do bad things. And that's why we have to take precaution. So a girl who is concerned about her sexual purity or chastity A girl who is concerned about her reputation and so on will not dress immodestly. She will not dress immodestly because she's concerned about her safety, about her reputation, about her chastity. Not only will she not dress immodestly, she will not go into places where those things are threatened. She's not going to hang out in a bar. She's not going to hang out at a club. She's not going to be at some drunken party on a college campus. A girl who's concerned about her chastity, about her salvation, about her reputation, and so on, she's not going to be in those places. The Catechism teaches that it's sin to even enter into the occasion of sin, the place or circumstances where sin is likely to take place. That's how we should be talking as Christians. Not debating whether that girl, little Mary, dressed in her miniskirt and high heels, going out to drink and hang out at the frat house, has a right to do so with no man touching. This is not even a rational conversation. Not even a rational conversation. And so if little Mary does choose to do that, and she chooses to put herself into those circumstances, and bad things happen because some man does something bad, they're both at fault. They're both the cause of that evil. And I know that may offend crazy people in modern society, but that's true. I'll give you an example of Jesus' teaching that shows us this principle. He says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth." Do not store up for yourself treasure on earth. So imagine you're an intelligent, working man. You study hard, you work hard, and your work is skillful, and you earn a great profit for your work. Let's say an honest, just profit for your work. You're wealthy, and you deserve to be wealthy because of the work that you do. Jesus says to you, do not store up treasure on earth. And why does he say that? Because earth is a bad place. That's why. He says, do not store up treasure on earth where thieves break in and steal. We live in a place called earth. He doesn't say your neighborhood or this city or this street. That's not what Jesus says. He says, do not store up treasure on earth because this is a place where thieves break in and steal. If you know that this is a place where thieves are on the lookout for treasures, and where they find them, they break in and steal them. If you know that evil exists, you would avoid it. And the way that you avoid it is by not storing up treasure. That's Jesus' way of avoiding trouble. That's how Jesus teaches us to live in this life, in this world, on this earth. We know it's evil, therefore we're not free to do whatever we want and blame the thieves. And if we take that principle of moral responsibility, we take that principle of preventing evil, we can see that that applies to every area of life. If I said, if you go out to clubs or drinking parties and things like this, men there will seduce and rape women. They will. They will seduce women and rape women. They will. Therefore, how should you act? You should not allow that situation to exist. Just like you would not store up treasure in a place where there are thieves. So also, you should not make yourself available. You should not dress provocatively or go out and drink and inhibit your senses and reasoning in a place where you know that there are seducers, sexually immoral people, rapists, and so on. And if you do so, what can anyone say? What can we say? Imagine the person who's got his house filled with treasure. He's got the finest furniture, he's got jewelry, he's got cash piled up, he's got the most expensive electronics, the finest possessions that can be found, all collected, gathered together, all treasured up in his house. And one night, thieves break in and steal his stuff, and this Christian man comes running out into the street, crying and screaming that all of his possessions have been stolen. Now, what modern society wants us to say is, that's terrible. He has a right to store up treasure on earth. He has a right to have his own stuff, whatever he wants. And all of the blame is upon these thieves and robbers. Now, you can say that, and you can pat yourself on the back, but all this guy's stuff is stolen. All this guy's stuff is stolen. All the stuff he worked for, all the possessions he treasured up, they're all gone. And you can sit there and you can pat him on the back and say, don't worry, Joseph, it wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. You have a right to buy whatever you want and have whatever you want in your house. It was those guys who did it. It's not your fault. Spite yourself. If that's how you want to live, you're right. But what if you don't want to live like that? What if you don't want to work and store up all your stuff and have it all stolen? What if you don't want to live like that? What if you don't want to be a girl who goes out and gets seduced or abused or raped or taken advantage? What if you don't want to be a raped girl? What if you don't want to be seduced or taken advantage of or forced in any way to do something that you really wouldn't want to do? If you were thinking clearly. Yeah, you can be seduced and you can lose your virginity and you can end up losing your chastity and you can even be raped, and you can sit there and have a whole crowd of women patting you on the back saying, hey, it wasn't your fault, wasn't your fault. It was that guy's fault. You can say that. But that doesn't change your condition. Jesus, when he teaches us how to live, he's trying to teach us how to live and live happily. He says, I have come that they may have life and have it more abundantly. He's trying to teach us how to be happy. He's trying to teach us how to not suffer the loss of things. He's trying to teach us how not to lose our dignity or be injured or be abused or even be killed. He's trying to teach us how to live soberly in this present age because it's evil. And we find in our society advice being given to young people that contradicts this loving advice of the Good Shepherd and encourages people to do things that are foolish, that cause them to suffer. And if you say anything to the contrary of you're free to do whatever you want, you're free to seek whatever pleasure you want, you're called chauvinistic, judgmental, unchristian, unloving, and this is just a bunch of baloney. Now, having said all of that, there's something about this that makes me even more upset. In this discussion with this woman, after she's arguing all these things, she says, I don't have any daughters. I don't have any daughters. And this is what makes me angry. If you don't have any daughters, who are you telling these things to? Who are you telling it's okay to go get dressed up immodestly, to go out in a public place, to get drunk with your friends, to go to a party, to do all of these things? If you don't even have any daughters of your own, who are you telling it's okay to do these things? You're telling my daughters it's okay to do these things. You're telling my daughters it's okay to be immodest. It's okay to go out and do this. It's okay to go out with your friends and get drunk in public. It's okay to go to this drinking party. It's okay to go out among all of these guys who are looking to take advantage of girls. It's okay. You're telling that to my daughters. And so you see, this is the same evil that we see as a developing movement in our society, where our society is talking to our children and telling our children that it's okay to disobey their parents. We're telling our children, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do this. We're telling our parents, we're telling our children, you should not store up treasure on earth. We're telling them, you should not go into these dangerous places. You should not surround yourself with this kind of people. You should not be drinking in public. You should not be using drugs or anything like that. You should not be in these places. You should not be going out driving around at midnight. You should not be doing these things. This is not what a prudent person would do. You need to be careful. We live in an evil world. Your mother and I, we want you to be safe. We want you to be happy. We don't want you to be injured. We don't want anything bad to happen to you. And you shouldn't do these things. That's parents commanding their children, which is their duty according to the 10 Commandments. And the children are told by God, children, honor your father and your mother. Children, obey your parents. And we don't even need to get into these discussions about, well, is the person at blame? Is the person guilty? All of this discussion is foolishness, because it's ignoring the real issue, which is that my daughters should obey my commands. Your daughters should obey your commands. Period. That's it. There's nothing else to talk about. If I say no, that's the rule. That's what my daughters should be encouraged to do. Anyone who's ever had their children work with me in tutoring will know that when other people's children talk to me or ask me questions, I tell them, you need to ask your parents what they want to do. You need to do what your parents tell you to do. If your parents tell you that they want you to study this, then you should study that. Not because you like it, not because you think it's so valuable, but simply because it's what your parents tell you to do. That's the motivation. That's why you should do it. You should do it because God commands it. You should do it for God's sake. It's actually a religious act. Your Latin study, if that's what your parents want you to study, can actually be the most meritorious of works, because you do it for God's sake. That's the most meritorious work that can be done. That's what children should be taught. When I work with students, that's what I tell them. I tell parents, you tell me what you want your children to do, and I'll encourage them to do that. They're your children. If you sign your children up to work with me for tutoring, and you and I disagree on something, we have two options. Either A, I can tell you that because of our disagreement, I'm not interested in working with your children. That's one option I have. Or I can agree to tutor your children, and even though I don't agree with you personally, I will still tell your child to do what you want them to do. I will tell them to do what you have established as their goals, and I'll help them to achieve those goals. Even if I don't personally agree with them, I'll help the children to do what you want them to do because you're their parent. And if I don't want to do that, my only option is to say, no thanks, we don't agree on this, and I don't think it would be good for me to work with your child, so you should probably find someone to work with your child who shares your views. Those are my options. And what we see in this society, the most glaring evil that I think we see in this society, and we're distracted by all of these discussions which really have nothing to do with the real issue. The real issue is our society is trying to reach children and tell them that they do not have to obey their parents. And I think if there's one mark, if there's one sign that these days are peculiarly evil and consequently dangerous, if there was one thing that I would point to, and I would say, you better keep your eye on this, because this is definitely different. This is definitely changing. That one thing would be the encouragement of children to disobey their parents. That would be the one thing in this list that St. Paul gives in 2 Timothy 3. When I think about what's happening with this transgender garbage, really utter filth, any talk about transgender anything is a distraction. The real evil is that children are being told that they don't have to obey their parents. It doesn't matter what the subject is. All the talk, and we're going to start debating now about gender, it's all a distraction. It's all a distraction. We're going to talk about children having abortions, children getting contraceptives, children being able to have sex changes if they want to without even telling their parents. All of these issues, the contraception, the abortion, the gender changes, they're all distractions because there's one fundamental evil behind all of these things, and it's one of the 10 Commandments. Children, obey your parents. And what we see in this generation is a radical increase in disobedience to parents. And when we read that, we say, well, where would that disobedience come from? Where would it come from? Would kids just randomly in one generation, they're just going to start being more disobedient? No, that's not what we see. That's not what we see. What we see is the society has no regard for the commandments, and the society appeals directly to the children and says to the children, come and follow us. You do not need to obey your parents. And I would argue that this is where the disobedience to parents is coming from. It's because of the ungodly society that has no respect for the order of the family, in the same way that the devil had no respect for the order of the family in the Garden of Eden and spoke to Eve rather than Adam. I think what we're seeing, the attack that we're seeing, is directed by our wicked enemy, not at the heads of households, not even at the Christian wives and mothers who know better, but the attack in this generation, which is most evil, is actually being targeted at our children. If there's one sign that we're getting closer to something that might be what St. Paul thought of as the last days, I think it's this one. Children will be disobedient to their parents. I hope that's helpful. Let me know what you think. God bless.